Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor. Hello guys, and welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. Okay, this is going to be very special. I don't know if you've been watching the news lately, but kind of the circulating in Fox News and Breitbart, there was a soundbite of a prominent professor, and we have him here today. He's very prominent professor. He's the director of bioethics at NYU. He's a published author, The Right to Be Loved. He's a very prominent speaker. Talking about bioethics and the ideas of ways to, I guess really the proper way to say it is ideas of ways to affect behavior change, right, on a population-wide basis. And, there were some startling sound bites, right? People are afraid he's going to take our meat away. Right, the juicy steak he talked about on this lecture was about in January. Is that right, Dr. Liao? Did I pronounce that right? By the way, your name just one more time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's Liao. Kind of rhymes
okay,
with
perfect.
Chow.
So. Yeah, got it, Dr. Liao. Look, I'm very happy to have you here. I'm very honored to have you here. We may disagree, but I think I want to give you a chance to talk more than that little sound bite. And I want to hear your thoughts. And so I'm very happy to have you here.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So maybe it's helpful if I just give a very quick overview of my view about this topic for you and for your audience. And then, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So the general idea is that, climate change is this really big problem. We've been trying to come up with solutions to it. We get people to sort of try to recycle. We have sort of market solutions, carbon taxes, and things like that. The Paris Agreement, we just got back into the Paris Agreement, which is a good thing. But there are worries that these measures are not going to be enough. And so some scientists are saying, maybe we need to do something like geoengineering. So geoengineering is this thing where it involves, for example, spraying sulfate aerosols into the ozone layer. But, that could be really dangerous. We only have one ozone. If you destroy the ozone layer, we're dead. And so in that context, where scientists are, taking seriously this idea that we may have to use geoengineering, as a philosopher, as a bioethicist, I said to myself, well, what else have we not looked at in this space, in terms of solutions? And so then I came upon this idea that maybe we can look at, human engineering, which is the biomedical modification of, us in order to make us better at mitigating the effects of climate change. And so what are some examples of, human engineering? And in my work, I actually make clear, and this, I think Tucker Carlson didn't make this very clear, but everything I say here is intended to be voluntary, right? Nothing is coerced. It's supposed to be sort of up to individuals to take. And usually also I try to go for what I call win-win solutions. And I'll give an example of that. So win-win solutions are basically things that, you'll want to do. Like people don't have to force you to do it. You'll just want to do it. So the example that I like to give is take iPhones, right? Nobody needs to force you to buy an iPhone. People queue up when new versions come out, right? And so that's the space, those are the things that I'm trying to look for in terms of win-win solutions. So the two examples that Tucker Carlson talked about, and I'll just mention that the first one will be very relevant for this group. And so basically the idea is that about 18% of greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock farming. So if we can just curb our, reduce our consumption, meat consumption, red meat consumption, we could have a great effect on the climate. And this is something that a lot of people have said. And so, and a lot of people, so there are people who just, they love their meats and they won't give up any of it, right? And so in that respect, there's nothing that I can say or do to change the opinions of those people. And then there are already people who are vegetarians. And so they've already given up eating meat. And so, there's that group. But there's this in-between group where, like they don't, there are people who, they're not vegetarians, but they would be happy to reduce their meat consumption. So not give up meat, but just sort of like eat a bit less meat, for a variety of reasons, health reasons, and so on and so forth. And even reducing a bit of meat could have a great effect on, on the climate. But, they just find eating meat irresistible, right? And so how can we kind of help, with these people who want to give up eating, just reduce eating a bit of meat, but they find it difficult to do so. So the idea was, well, maybe we can create something, eating is a biological thing, right? Even sort of dieting is a kind of human engineering. You're kind of manipulating your body in a certain way, right? And so we know that, and so the example I gave, which became kind of controversial, was I gave an example from my own self, because I'm milk intolerant, right? So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, there's sort of, that means there's certain types of things that I don't want to eat, right? Or I can't eat, right? And so maybe if we can think more about our biology, we can kind of tinker with our biology, we can affect the way we eat, eat certain types of food, right? And so, so the basic idea is that, so here's a picture, which is about a meat patch, right? So there are ways of affecting the way we eat meat. One of the things I suggested was we can create some sort of meat patch, kind of like nicotine patch, right? And that patch could, you could put it on, take it off whenever you like. And when you put it on, it'll sort of produce certain sensations or effects on your body such that you may not want to eat the meat anymore. So for example, it could make the meat taste very sweet, right? And some people, when things are very sweet, they say, ugh, I don't want to eat that anymore, right? So it could be as simple as that. In this case, the picture behind me, it's sort of, there's a professor from Oxford. He created this, he sort of took this idea and he created a meat patch. And basically this meat patch produces a smell of bacon, right? And so the idea is that when you smell bacon, you've become sated, right? You feel like, okay, you've already had your share of meat. And so you don't want to eat more meat. And so this is actually being marketed right now. So it's like being sold as 5 patches, right? You can put it on your arm and somehow, it's like basically working with your smell, right? That system. So anyways, that's one idea. Maybe I should pause there. Do you want me to go on to the other one? I thought that one is probably the most relevant for your audience.
I'm gonna first highlight basically how what you're describing we're already doing in modern medicine. First of all, you brought up in this clip, in this lecture you gave, about the Lone Star tick,
yeah.
Right? And the Lone Star tick can produce an allergy to bovine proteins. Now, it's not the first time that we've used nature for our own purposes. If you look at the tooth of a tick, it has many blood thinning properties, and we've highlighted those and made them into drugs. Maybe you've seen a commercial, the lay audience, for Xarelto. Do you want to sue your doctor for Xarelto? Do you want to sue your doctor for Eliquis? And the reason why you'd want to sue your doctor for those is because they thin the blood, and doctors don't often talk to their patients about what are the side effects. But we use these drugs, actually, it has a therapeutic purpose, right? We get all of our best drugs from nature, and they prevent strokes in atrial fibrillation. So we've literally done what you've proposed already in another therapeutic class. And then I want to just bring up this idea of taking something to make to take away the pleasure of it, right? We've done this with alcohol, right? There's a medication called Antabuse, and there's another medication called naltrexone. And these two drugs, literally what they do is they take away the feeling of reward, right? And they also give you a little bit of nausea if you drink with it. That's the end abuse. There are these, so we've already done essentially the blueprint for what you're suggesting is already here, right? Which I think is what actually makes it a little bit more scary, right? Is that it could be very easily done. And I think that makes the fear that people get when they hear these ideas that much more pronounced, right? Because he's coming to take my meat away, right? And now I want to just, present you a different viewpoint, right? I know that there are big organizations like Eat Lancet that have talked about lowering meat consumption. In fact, the weekly portion is maybe 100 grams is what they recommend. And yet, my area of focus is metabolic health, diabetes, and obesity. And we have found that actually meat consumption in an interventional way improves, low carbohydrate diets, which are heavy in meat, improve diabetes, they're effective for weight loss. And so when the guidelines coming from above say limit meat, right, and yet we have these populations which are growing, obesity and diabetes, which are growing, when we have these populations that seem to benefit from meat consumption, I get a little bit worried, right? I get a little bit worried that are we basically looking at food frequency questionnaires and population-based data that are saying one signal that, hey, you could be healthier without meat, right? And are we not paying enough attention to shorter term trials that are 6 months to a year that say, hey, wait a second, maybe meat's not so bad, especially for obesity and diabetes. And here's the other point, right? We've looked at meat supplementation and in children, right? In New York City, you're in New York City, just like I am. And there in New York, there's Meatless Mondays, right? Okay. And this was really applauded by environmentalists as a great first step. But if you consider that meat supplementation in children prevents stunting, and actually meat supplementation in children increases IQ because of the nutritional value that it provides, and you think, who are the people most likely to get harmed by this policy? I think it's people who couldn't afford, the supplements of the absence of, having to supplement in the absence of meat. The very well-off families that otherwise have access to, say, fish or other, more nutritious vegetables like avocados, right? So the people most likely to suffer from a policy that restricts meat, right, maybe the poorest people with the least access to food who potentially may benefit. So with these cultural and socioeconomic considerations, should we even be talking about limiting meat? I mean, that's my first question. Sorry, I know this is, a long-winded question, but is it more complicated than, hey, the environment will benefit from meat reduction and this is what we should do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for that. And, first of all, I just want to say, great examples about sort of the abuse and, sort of the fact that, basically when I mentioned the Lone Star tick, I was trying to also suggest that the biological mechanism's already there. It's possible. Not that that's exactly what we should do. There's sort of course, whatever you do, it's got to meet the marketing test, right? People have to want to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to persuade anybody to do it, right? And it wouldn't be a win-win solution, as I was saying earlier. On your question about whether we should, sort of just limit meat. So to be completely transparent, I'm a meat eater. I'm not a vegetarian. So I totally share and agree with you about the nutritional value of meat. And so I think there are a variety of reasons why, you've given all the very good reasons why we should be eating meat. So I take what I was saying, not to be against that at all, but what's true is that what's true in the environmental context is that certain types of meat have they have greater effect on the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So in particular, the red meat, right? So we're not talking about fish, we're not talking about chicken, we're talking mainly about cows and things like that. And so the idea here is that, and so the thought is, well, maybe we can just limit those type, like sort of reduce our consumption of those meat, not eliminate, like, people can still have their juicy steaks, but, sort of, can we reduce the consumption of that? And is that enough? That's one question. Is that, and could we do that in order to sort of offset, to help the climate? But the follow-up question that I don't know the answer to, and you may know the answer to, is what's the effect of limiting just red meat, like sort of reducing red meat? So suppose that, people now, the public policy is such that we make sure that children have fish and chicken and eggs and things like that, sort of a lot of other low carb things. Sorry, do you want me to repeat that? Because I don't know.
Yeah, is that the NYU sirens?
Yes, the NYU siren going, so.
Yeah,
No,
we heard it. I think we heard it. Should we replace, what happens if you're nutritionally replete? You're eating plenty of fish and eggs, and would there be an environmental benefit to just particularly red meat reduction? I think that's kind of the question you're posing. Yeah,
or would there be a health detriment if you kind of reduce just red meat consumption, but you still get all the other types of meat? So that's that's a scientific question, and you would know more than I would about it. I guess I was thinking that if you still get to eat fish and chicken and eggs and all these other things, and then maybe occasionally red meat, but just not like just reduce the consumption, that wouldn't affect your health that much. But I could be wrong about that. So I stand like.
No, I mean, look, I don't think it's been effectively studied. I mean, certain populations have been very healthy without red meat.
Yeah.
There are some populations that, have predominantly eaten, fish and rice, for example, and didn't have metabolic issues until fairly recently in history. For example, sub-Asian populations consisted mainly off of rice as the backbone of the diet and never had metabolic issues. So I think, but I guess the question becomes is, what is the stated goal, and what are the negative outcomes of maybe that goal? And now, if the goal is environment, right, and that is the focus, right, and there are potentially negative consequences of limiting red meat, whether it's preference, whether it's health outcomes. Is that the best? Is that the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the stated goal, which is, can we, infect the environment? Can we impact the environment in a positive way through behavior change? Now, I would just say, as a meat lover, right? And I wasn't always that way, but as a meat lover, I noted something, and this isn't scientific evidence, but when we saw the decrease in travel from the COVID pandemic, and the reduction in, transportation emissions, I thought to myself, wow, here we have a pandemic that created a significant amount of behavior change instantly. And we saw the Niagara Falls water clearing up. We saw the smog in China decreasing, direct impacts instantly from behavior change. And it made me wonder, like, is the focus on meat, as a meat lover, is the focus on meat reduction the more ethical approach, given that maybe the greenhouse gas emissions are modestly affected by red meat, maybe 20%, I think you quoted in your lecture.
That's right.
There's some people who may argue, that's, if you look at the carbon sequestered from the soil, there's a lot of people who have different ways of looking at the number, but let's just say it's 20%. Should we focus on the 80%?
Mhm.
Or should we focus on the 20%? And really, the pandemic made me think that maybe the more ethical thing, and you tell me, should be maybe focus on that 80%. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Is it just the biased meat lover in me that's like wants to make people, uh, focus on that 80%? What do you think about when I say, hey, that 20%, if we focus on that, the really poor and the cultural sensitivities, those people may be affected. So what do you, like, ethically speaking, what should we do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So basically, it's what philosophers call imperfect obligation. Maybe there's a duty to help the climate, but we kind of don't know exactly what we should be doing. Like, is it reduce our consumption of meat? Is it travel less? Less air travel? Is it what is it? And it's kind of like, it's because it's an imperfect obligation, it's left up to us to figure out which ones we want to do first, right? And so my view, I don't think that there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's like one thing that you can do to help the climate. It's a sort of, the climate change is a very complex problem. There are many sources. It's also not just air travel, it's also like transportation. It's also, there's a bit of the way we farm and things like that, but it's a bunch of things, right, that together contribute to the problem. And so the unpacking, the sort of dealing with it, probably we need sort of different approaches. And so in that context, I guess it's possible maybe we can solve the climate change without telling people to restrict meat consumption. And if there's a way of doing that, great. So I think we want to come up with solutions that people are happy with, and that at the same time deal with the problem. That would be a win-win solution. So if a lot of people, look, they really love their meat, and that we're trying to push them in that direction, that would not be good. So so I think we need to be open to that. And that's why sort of in my talks I talk about other types of solutions, right? So let me just give one example, and we can come back to the diet thing. So what do I mean by win-win solution? So here's a more sci-fi example. The meat example, as Dr. Trolla said, is I was trying to give examples that are more realistic. This one is slightly more sci-fi, but imagine, so cats can see just as well as we can during the day, but about 7 times better than we can at night. And we know that because cats have night vision, right? Both Dr. Troy and I live in New York. So, if you fly into New York, back in the days when we used to fly, you'll see that all the lights, there's so much light on every night in big cities, right? And just across the globe, every single night. That's a lot of energy, right? So just imagine that we can have night vision, right? So eyes where you can see just as well during the day, but 7 times better at night. Just so we can reduce our energy consumption by many folds, if we just have better night vision, right? And that, I think, so now if I pose the question to you all, how many people would you be willing to have this kind of eye, right? So you can see just as well during the day, but just 7 times better at night. I for one would just sign up. I have very bad eyes. I'm wearing contacts right now, so it's like, sign me up. Yeah, right. So perfectly happy to have it. And so that's what that's what I mean by a win-win solution, in the sense that people would just be willing to have it, and and then it has also this effect on the climate, right? And so that's the sort of the area that that I'm trying to find and locate for us in
I think that a lot of times, a comment like that, right? I know, see, that's not even too far off, right? We are able to program cells. If you look at the way the adenovirus vaccine vector, the vaccine vectors work and mRNA vaccines work, we're programming the cell to create a protein with which we're fighting against, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the basis of these new amazing technologies. And I think that, on one hand, it's scary, and on one hand, it's brilliant. I mean, instantly, we can program the body to make an antigen, and we can protect a humanity, right? We can protect, so there's amazing therapeutic potential, but there's also, with that, so much to worry about, side effects, one, am I going to get myocarditis? Am I going to get pericarditis? Am I going to get this rare, clot disorder? Am I going to get bleeding? And so to go from sci-fi to therapy, right, becomes one, I mean, what you propose is magnificent. Sign me up. If I have no chance of side effects and night vision, give it to me. But the reality is I don't think we're far off from what you're proposing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and just to stick with the bioethics of it, the level of coercion that's happened with regards to vaccine uptake, right, in the population is a little bit worrisome for me as somebody who's a liberty lover,
mm-hmm.
right? They've had lotteries for vaccine uptake. They're recommending it in kids even before the FDA really, qualified of it. We had doctors recommending the vaccine before the FDA had even approved it. So there's a level of coercion, and there's marketing campaigns now to get vaccinated. And so sometimes, you have this great idea and a magnificent technology, right? And then maybe we don't understand it all that well. And maybe there's somebody who will suffer. And when we coerce a population to do something, it becomes concerning for people who may not want to accept those minor risks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So how do we approach this? I think, ethics has really come into play here, because even though you said it's sci-fi, it's not far off. Gene therapy, we are literally curing sickle cell, right? In some people. Now we're able to override that genetic defect,
mm-hmm.
right? So with CRISPR technology and all of these new technologies that are coming out, and the mRNA technology, DNA therapies, right? It's not far off.
Mm-hmm.
But that worries me.
Mm-hmm.
Should I be worried, or should I? I mean, I'm terrified. I hear you talking about, making kids, smaller in size, right?
Yeah.
The idea of making kids smaller in size to reduce their carbon footprint. And I am absolutely terrified. I'm like,
mm-hmm.
I can't even think about that. Like my own moral values would tell me, and I don't know if my thinking is right, but it's like my radar is off the charts. Like this
mm-hmm.
is wrong. That's my gut instinct.
Yeah.
So help me understand this as a bioethicist.
Yeah.
My gut is, be careful. This is not good.
Yeah.
So tell me how I should, you're a thinker, you're an imaginer. How do you reconcile the difference? How do you reconcile these differences?
Great questions. And, thank you for those comments. So just take another one of the things I suggested was that, maybe we can have smaller people. And the idea is just that over a lifetime, larger, like taller people tend to use more energy compared to smaller people. Just think of a lifetime of resources of transporting someone bigger rather than someone smaller. Now, why did I suggest that? Well, this was in the context. This has to be contextualized a little bit. So when I wrote the paper, Britain was considering a two-child policy, right? Kind of like China's one-child policy. So one-child policy existed, for like almost 30 years. Now they're relaxing it because they're having, birth rate problems in China. But for a long time, you can only have one child. Now, if you're a liberty lover, right, that really restricts your liberty, right? To tell you can only have one child. It's very drastic. A lot of people would like to have more children. So, the idea was that with having smaller children was, well, if you're really serious about telling people that they can only have one child or two children, right? Then maybe we can also think about that. And if you're doing this because of the climate, right? Then maybe it's more liberty enhancing. So why don't we just give people, like a family, a sort of a greenhouse gas quota? right? And sort of let them decide whether they want to have one large child or two medium-sized children, right? Like let them decide, and that in some ways is a bit more liberty enhancing, right? And the idea is that, and the other thing I say is, we're not talking about hobbit-sized people or like children who will be so small that they'll be get eaten by cats, right? So my suggestion was and I looked this up. 100 years ago, we're on the average about 15 centimeters shorter, right? So if you go to Versailles, you kind of have to duck your head, right? The beds are smaller. And things like that. People on the average were, about 15 centimeters shorter, and there was nothing wrong with it. We had Einstein, Max Planck, Marie Curie, like lots of brilliant people lived 100 years ago, right? Tesla, and so on and so forth. So we know that physiologically, that's just like it's a status quo thing. We just happen now on the average for men to be 5'9", and or for women about 5'4" or something like that. Maybe it's changed now. Okay, so now, we can, as a philosopher, I think about this, sort of imagine that in 50 years time, the average height is 8 feet tall or 9 feet tall, right? And now someone said, look, maybe we should just roll back to 50 years ago where people are 5'9" or 5'7". Probably there'll be the same conversation. There'll be the same outrage. Oh my God, these people, they're gonna roll the height back to 5'9" and 5'4". But we know right now that 5'9" and 5'4", we're doing just fine. We can live a decent life and so on and so forth. So I think there's a bit of a status quo bias, like thinking that somehow there's like, there's like an optimal height and we have it right now, right? And in fact, if you look at, if you just look at height, centenarians, like people who live over 100 years old, none of them is like over 6 feet tall, right? And that's because taller people tend to have cardiovascular diseases, they tend to have joint problems, so they actually die earlier. So there are actually advantages to being a bit smaller. There's also like space travel, right? If people want to go to Mars, right? The first people going to Mars are not going to be very, they're not going to be very big, because think of all the resources you need to keep those people alive, right? The bigger they are, the more resources you're going to need to keep them alive. So that's going to be a constraint. So those are things that, I think we're already thinking about, and so on and so forth. Now, to answer Dr. Tro's question, Dr. Tro might say, wow, that's exactly why I'm so scared, right? This is very scary stuff, right? And so there are a couple of things I want to say about that. The first of all, the first thing is that, like, again, everything I say here, these are intended to be voluntary. I've said that many times, like in my print, et cetera, et cetera. We shouldn't be forcing anybody. I'm as liberty loving, like I love my liberty. That's why I am in the academia, right? So nobody tells me what to do, so I get to set my own research agenda and so on and so forth. So I think liberty is very important. We need to respect that. We need to protect that, right? If we don't protect it, there's a chance that we'll lose it, and that's a bad thing. So we, like definitely we don't want to do that. At the same time, there are a lot of these interventions that could help us, that could make our lives better, that could make, for example, going to Mars a possibility, right? And here's why, like, you might think, well, who cares about going to Mars, right? Well, if you just think, ahead, we know that the sun is going to die out, right? That's a fact, right? 3 billion years, 4 billion years, whatever. At some point, the sun will die out, and everybody, all life on Earth will be gone, right? So if we care about the survival of human species, right, our survival, like the survival of our children, we have to look at some of these technologies, right? And so it's a balance of risks and benefits. And I think that these technologies will enable us, like looking into them at least, some of them will allow us to engage in intergalactic space travel, go into other planets, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's why it's important to think about those things. But we need to balance that, and Dr. Cho is absolutely right. We need to balance that, against, our other values that we hold, like liberty, right?
Yeah, the more I hear you talk, the more I get the sense that this is like your suggestions or thought experiments, right? Challenging the way we think more than necessarily a blueprint. What I fear, and, I think, I want to come back to two things. Well, let's look at the potential negatives of human engineering, right? And let's say lab leak is a complete conspiracy, but the fact that we could even think about it, right, and consider it as a possibility, right, gain of function testing, right, and potential negative consequences, right? I don't know. It just makes me, the recent events have made me even more cautious that maybe we need to really consider the ethics of what we're doing, right, and the types of research that we do as a thought experiment. As a doctor and as somebody who studied pharmacotherapy, I know that understanding the genome and being able to manipulate genes has unlimited therapeutic potential, right? But then again, I mean, we have an example of potentially, gain of function research. Not that I'm believing the theory, but even entertaining the idea like we're doing now, it could have huge and disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
And we've all seen, all the sci-fi movies with Will Smith where, everybody becomes zombies. So, are you challenging the way we think? My fear is people or organizations let's say, a government that wants to limit the amount of offspring you can have, or people that would benefit from a population eating plant-based meat, right? Like whole grains, companies that make grains, these companies who expedited approval through the FDA to get their novel ingredients approved for plant-based meat. I wonder to what extent that they would hijack your thought experiment for their own gains, right? Hey, we'll give you another child, an artificial construct they created, but it has to be small, right? Hey, you can still eat your meat. It has to be the plant-based meat with our novel, patented lentiglobin, which hasn't been tested. So, so help me understand, because I fear that, like the imaginary, I love the creative and imaginary thinking. I love that. I feel like that voice will be captured by people with not humanity's interests. And maybe that gain of function, the idea of the gain of function research resulting in potentially disastrous outcomes is a great example of that. Help me understand, like, am I off base here? Are my thoughts off base?
I don't think you're off base at all. So and I think you're expressing very real worries, and they're not even fictional. So I actually just published an edit collection called The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. It's all about AI. And so, and similar debates are happening in the space of AI as well, right? So AI can be, there are a lot of benefits to artificial intelligence. People are using it in the medical setting, to diagnose cancer, for self-driving cars and stuff like that, right? But there are governments that are also using AI for things like facial recognition and to basically, to discriminate against minorities and things like that, right? And so I think what you're saying is that, once the technology is there, it's kind of, technologies are always dual use. They can be used for good, but they can also be used for very bad. And the more powerful technology something is, the more damage you can do, right? And so, so how do we deal with that, right? So one way to go is to just not develop any more technologies, right? We just stop, be happy with what we have now and just put a pause.
But that's not humanity.
Yeah, that's not the way we are. Like we just like there will be somebody in the garage who will be developing certain things that will come out and everybody will, and then once it's accessible, once it's online, everybody else will know it and then they'll get developed, right? So the other way is through good governance, right? And this is why international, like I'm a firm believer in sort of international cooperation, in sort of like just working together with other people to come up with good rules and frameworks for for dealing with new novel technologies, right? And that's really, really important because if we don't do that, Dr. Stroh's absolutely right. It's going to get really bad. Here, I'll just give you one example. So think, those unmanned drones, right? Well, it turns out that you can put algorithms into those drones to attack people like without any human control. And you might think that's fictional, but in fact, in Turkey, that happened, right? There was a manned drone that just on its own attacked somebody, right? And you can just imagine that more and more of these, we're going to have these lethal autonomous weapons running around killing human beings. And that's going to be a really bad world. And we don't want a world like that. And there's, either we just don't develop it, I think, but the cat's out of the bag. There's, like people already know how to do this. So the only other way is to have international regulation. We need to come together and we need to really work to figure out and really punish people who violate those rules, to go against the rules and use those weapons, on human beings. And so in my work, I'll just say one other thing. In my work, I've been developing what I call a human rights context. And this is related to my book on the children's right to be loved. There I developed a human rights framework. So I think we need a really robust human rights framework to deal with a bunch of these problems. And that's really my starting point. And so my starting point is I think we have things like a right to bodily integrity, right? That means people shouldn't be putting things into our body if we don't want them to be put in our body. So there I totally agree with Dr. Troy. But, we should make sure that our liberty is not infringed unless we're going to harm other people, right? So that's a very common liberal notion, right, of like the importance of liberty and various other protections. We need to have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. And so, but, I think in that space, we do need to be careful. And somewhat of what I say, Dr. Stroh's right, they're thought experiments. They could be used in bad ways. And I'm sort of conscious of that. And sort of in other areas, I've been trying to sort of promote international regulations, human rights, and so on and so forth. But there's always the rogue actor. Like, you can say whatever you want to say, but if someone wants to do evil things with something, it's hard to stop them, right? And that's why stopping like evil doers is kind of a collective action problem. And this is why I wanted to be on this podcast and sort of talk to you, because I feel like there are a lot of people who, like you care about the ethics, right? And insofar as you care about the ethics, we're on the same page. We might disagree about the details of how to get there, but we both care about doing what's right and what's wrong, and we're trying to do the right things for the world. And so I feel like we have a common language here, even though we might disagree about the substances of how we should get there.
Yeah, look, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. The pro me, here's I'm gonna end off with this. If I was, one of the solutions you presented to potential negative outcomes from technology is, a global governance, right? And that global governance may be the only way to deal with the impending flourishing of technology and new knowledge, especially from a genetic standpoint. With what we know about genetics and our ability to manipulate therapies, at this point, I think we're on a trajectory, a golden age of pharmaceutical interventions is coming in the next 20 years. I firmly believe that. Now, when you look at global governance, I think this recent pandemic has made people distrust public health to some extent, distrust potential global governance, the ability to govern globally. And one of the things I'd like to point out is the mere example of that you brought out in Turkey, the use of drones. There was a war that literally used drones and nobody really did anything. Nobody really did anything between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The use of drones was almost, ubiquitous. And, literally the world watched it unfold. So we've had this war that global governance failed, and we have this pandemic where the disparate public health responses and unclear messaging have made people disenfranchised. And then the last thing I'd like to say is back to that idea of, people and organizations that will abuse your message, right? If I was, the Impossible Burger, I would want to prop you up to talk about meat all day long, right? Because your message supports the outcome of reducing meat, buying their product, and promotes maybe those organizations like Eat Lancet, which are global, and may not, and while they may make sense on a population level, they may not make sense at the level of the individual, right? So if the solution is people and organizations, right, to the problem of advancing technology, I haven't been sold. In fact, I don't believe it. And I'm going to leave it there because I think we're coming on time, and I know you're a busy professor and you probably have to go. But I wonder if we can do what it is you suggest to truly govern globally in a fair way, an equitable way. I pray for that. I hope for that. And I'll leave it there. I'll give you a closing statement. And guys, I just want to thank Dr. Liao, author of The Right to Be Loved, Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, prominent professor at NYU, director of Bioethics. I really appreciate you coming on and stooping to the level of a lowly, internal medicine, obesity medicine doctor. This has really been fun, and I'll let you, you have the floor for a couple of minutes, and then you can tell people where they can get your book and if they want to reach out to you, how they do that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So I think I just wanted to comment on what you said about the public health, the inadequacy of the public health response to COVID-19 and the sort of the global governance issues. I think you're right. Our response just has been bad to terrible in some ways. The question is whether whether we have any other alternatives and whether we can do better. Like, do we just throw the baby out of the bathwater, or is this like what we have? So human beings are not perfect. None of us is perfect, and we did a lot of things that were not quite right. With respect to the with respect to the pandemic, we didn't warn people early enough, for example. But so the way I see it is, we're never going to have a perfect system. We shouldn't be let perfect be the enemy of the good or adequate or whatever. It's a work in progress. Governance is a work in progress. Unlike where I sit in philosophy, where you have these idealized things, right? Real world is messy, and I'm stating the obvious here. And so I think that but I think we shouldn't give up. My view is we shouldn't give up. We should work, try to work with it, try to make it better, try to put in ideas. Like, each of us has a responsibility to, just put forward, pour our weight, do something to help the public health. We shouldn't also just rely on the government to kind of get things done. We need to do our things. Like, we need to take initiatives. We need to get our voices out there. We need to do things in a way that's constructive, right? There are a lot of people do things but it's not like, not all of it's very constructive. Like, we need to if we think that the solution is not good, come up with an alternative, like come up with something better, right? And so I think we need to be constructive because this is like our society, our world, and we're all in this together. The pandemic, if anything, has shown me that, look, the world's very interconnected and we gotta do things to help each other to get it right? It's not just us. We can't just live in a bubble and think that, look, we just do our own thing, everything will be good. It hasn't worked out that way. And it's, as the world gets more interconnected through these technologies, we need to more than ever work together.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of my amazement at your reaction, at some of the sound bites and watching your lectures has been fear of change, one, and really a fear that this is a dystopian reality that could happen. And we shouldn't let fear drive us, and we should come up with ways to work together and solve things. So I really applaud that message. And thank you so much for coming on. You didn't have to do this, and you did it. So I really appreciate your time. And this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we have a couple questions, but I think we really answered them all. We had somebody here who, we have some people raising their hands, and you can write in a question and talk it out. But bottom line, there's a recommendation here. If you want to check out the Climate Facts on Cattle, Frank Middlehorner. So maybe you've already seen it, but that's the recommendation. Anyway, Dr. Liao, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Schwartz.